You can say a lot about Dan Snyder, but you can't say that he knows how to quit while he's behind. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
Your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome, Commanders fans, to the Locked On Commanders podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. We are your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, and we're doing it free and available on all platforms, including YouTube and the WUSA 9 Plus app for your Roku or your Amazon Fire Stick. And we thank you for making us your first listen or your first view of the day. I'm David Harrison, staff writer for Commander Country, a part of Sports Illustrated's FanNation. And my co-host is Chris the Rooster Russell, part of the Russell and Medhurst show on the Team 980, live Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to noon Eastern time, or anytime on the Odyssey app, and a writer for the Command Post, a subscription-based service.
Absolutely. Coming up, David is in Indianapolis at the annual Scouting Combine and was part of a group of reporters that were able to talk to head coach Ron Rivera of the Washington Commanders. What did he say? And why don't we believe all of it, perhaps? That's coming up. But first, and also, in addition, I should say, the Commanders make an expected decision a little bit early. But why? But David, we start with the Dan Snyder volcano, which is just Mount Erebus. It's boiling over, and it feels like an avalanche of doom. This is what I talked about, my friend, privately and publicly, the 24-hour period from, let's just say, Monday afternoon, and it started way before that, really dating all the way back to last week. But the 24-hour period, including Carson Wentz and Bobby McCain getting released and team statements issued at 10:15 following a Washington Post report. And then you wake up on Tuesday morning, and again, you're in Indianapolis, so I don't know when you were able to see it, but I know it happened when I was driving to Washington, D.C. on Tuesday morning to do my radio show. All of a sudden, Don Van Natta of ESPN drops an absolute, again, hurricane of epic proportions on us. And I mean, there's a lot of details. We're not going to be able to go over it, but basically, here's what you need to know. Dan Snyder, apparently, according to federal authorities, according to Van Natta and ESPN, took out a $55 million loan without the required approval of his former team co-owners, Dwight Schrute, Bob Rothman, and FedEx Fred Smith. And that has him in hot water, not only with them, but also with the feds.
Yep. I mean, the more we look into Dan Snyder, the more dirt you just find. The thumbnail for today's episode says Dan keeps digging because Dan just keeps on digging. There's not enough mud for Dan Snyder apparently to get himself into. I mean, it's just again, it's just more of the same, and it's more of a reason why this league needs to just move on. And I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, like, what the NFL needs to understand is, like, he is so dirty at this point in time. And again, all these are whatever allegations until they're proven and everything else, but he's getting dirt on them. And I mean, there's not a whole lot of fans out there sitting there saying, man, look at my billionaire owner and how great of a person this is anyway. But, I mean, this is a whole different level of disgusting. And I will tip my cap at least to the National Basketball Association, something that they do a lot better than the National Football League does. Well, two things they do a lot better is connecting with the youth audience of their brand, and number two is getting rid of dirtbag owners. Dan Snyder has done at least 10, 12 different things that would have gotten an NBA owner ousted for just doing the one thing, let alone doing all these things. And we're still sitting here doing this dance about what does Dan want and what does Dan think and who does Dan want to do this with and who doesn't he want to do this with. And it's ridiculous that the NFL owners, I mean, honestly, it shows the entitlement. They understand. Honestly, they're not wrong. So I mean, like, they understand that the NFL is so powerful in today's American society that even this really doesn't do anything to their bottom line. They're going to be just as rich next year as they were this year, and they were richer this year than they were the year before. Even with a guy like this continuing to do these things and staying and not being forced to sell his franchise. Like it's ridiculous. Man.
Yeah, I said on Twitter the other night, maybe it was Monday night, I can't even remember. It's slimy protecting slimy, right? And Dan is more and worse than slimy, quite honestly, from all of his business practices. And again, I want to be clear. He treated me with respect, right? We had pleasant conversations. He never did anything wrong with me. So this isn't an axe to grind or anything like that. This is just the truth. You see it almost every day with all of his business practices and all of his activities. And again, there is no greater maybe consequence than the decision he made to again take a $55 million loan. And oh, by the way, not bother to tell his business partners about it against the bylaws of essentially the team's constitution of the shareholder agreement, right? So again, we can talk about a lot of different things and what he does, what he doesn't do, what he's represented on the field, off the field. Again, terrible practices, terrible things that he's allegedly done to people, so on and so forth. But David, think about this, right? You know, we've spent a lot of the last however long saying, hey, you know, is there an end in sight to the Dan Snyder era? When can this team move on? It might move on with not only Dan Snyder eradicated, but maybe Dan Snyder in handcuffs. Think about that. And, and I told you last November, I know we had this conversation. As soon as I found out that the federal authorities, the federal government was involved and threw their hat into this ring in the Eastern District of Virginia, which, you know, for those that aren't kind of aware, the Alexandria area, that type of thing. As soon as the feds got involved, I said, oh, and I know I said it here and we talked about it. I said, that is really bad for Dan because the feds don't get involved unless there's a reason specifically to get involved. David, I think we found out on Tuesday what that reason was.
Yeah, I mean, look, and there's a couple things there, right? So, like in law enforcement, like there are people who need to get taught. There are people who need to be corrected, and there are people who need to be arrested. And if a guy needs to be arrested, well, then go do the arresting. Like that's the bottom line. If a guy shows you he needs to be arrested, go do the arresting and take care of your business. But the other side of this thing is like the ridiculous nature of this whole situation, like. Because Dan Snyder is just incessantly trying to fight every little thing. Like I'm pretty sure at this point in time, if somebody were to be like, I went to elementary school with Dan Snyder and he copied off my spelling test, he would put out an official statement saying that absolutely did not happen and it was completely inaccurate and maybe even file a lawsuit against that person for slander. Like the amount of ridiculous and the thing that he doesn't understand, which is amazing that he's succeeded in business as much as he has to get to this point in his life, is when you pull on a thread and that thread comes loose, right? And you find a deficiency. People continue looking for more deficiencies because that one deficiency leads to another and leads to another and leads to another. So your best opportunity, like if you know, like first of all, don't be dirty. But if you know you're dirty, like dude, like if you know what else is to be found, step up and say, okay, like you know what, you got me, guys. You know what I mean? And inside your own head, you're like, you got me for this, but you ain't get me for all that. You got me. Here, let me pay my penance. Here, let me do my thing. Here's my official apology. Here's my lawyers paying all these fines and doing all these things and draft picks go away. Okay. Oh, hey, sorry guys, you got me. Don't worry. I'll behave now. And you know what? People stop looking. Like to be completely honest, like at a certain point, people stop looking. But because you continue, like you just stand up and say, like, no, you're wrong. I didn't do this. Like, oh, you didn't do this. Okay. Well, how about this? Well, how about this? People are going to keep and continue looking because you keep continuing to try to get away. And not only do you keep trying, but you keep getting away with stuff. I want to know who runs this bank because when my oldest daughter turned 18, like prior to that, we had her on an account with us because she's a minor. And that's how USAA does it, to deposit her paycheck so she can have access to her paycheck, have a debit card, do her online shopping, whatever she wants to do with her money. And when she turned 18, we called her like, hey, she's 18. She's an adult now. Take the parents off the account and just make it her own account. We couldn't do it. Yeah. Like, Chris, my daughter has a bank account with a different bank because they couldn't figure out how to do this. But Dan Snyder got a $50+ million loan that he's not supposed to have. Well, make it make sense.
No, everything you just said there is like how normal people operate, but that's just the problem. I would get, first of all, Bank of America was a corporate partner of the Washington NFL franchise. I don't know if they still are. I know they were for a long time. Yeah. That's number one. Number two, when you're dealing with a man as powerful as Dan Snyder and lawyers and whatnot, and financial people, you're dealing with heavy hitters. So maybe the same, and I don't know this, maybe the same, sort of like proof and business practices don't always exist. I don't know if they do, because that's maybe the only way that I can wrap my head around the fact that Bank of America gave him the money without, again, the written approval of Dwight Schrute, Bob Rothman, and FedEx Fred Smith. That's the only way I could do it. The problem is Dan may have thought, I can get away with this. I can do it. They won't notice. They won't see. And then there's all sorts of other accusations about, paying himself to advertise the team logo helmet on his plane as advertising and salary and all these business expenses that were personal expenses and Dan thought his, number two didn't stink and that he could get away with anything. And he probably manipulated people that wanted to do business or thought, he's an NFL owner. He's good. We can give him the $55 million loan. Nobody can. No skin off of our back. It's not illegal per se to do. He's got to deal with that. But maybe that's the kind of thought process when you get into these big circles of trust and power and quite honestly, ego. And that's maybe what lands him in ultimately this situation. David, there's so much more that we have to obviously get through, that we're going to have to get to as we go along, because this story continues to change and it continues to change literally by the hour. But we have other important stuff, like Ron Rivera speaking in Indianapolis on Tuesday. Did he actually say anything? David was there. He had a ringside seat for old Ronnie to spew whatever he wanted to spew. We'll get to David's firsthand view of that, plus the House of Pain gets paid. Today's episode of Locked On Commanders is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It is more than the midway point of the NBA season, and now's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. So if you want the bonus bets, maybe you should bet on, the Lakers, who are now going to have to do it without LeBron James after that amazing 27-point-plus comeback on Sunday in Dallas. Now LeBron's going to miss a couple of weeks because of a foot injury. So you bet on the Lakers, you lose, and you get the no-sweat first bet back up to $1,000. That's how you do it. Download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line, point scores, and everything in between. And so many more exclusive bets. Why don't you try a 2x3, 2 3-pointers scored in the first 3 minutes? It's all available for you on FanDuel Sportsbook. Don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, thanks for being with us right here on the Locked On Commanders podcast, and thanks for making us your first listen and watch of the day. David Harrison is with us from the Scouting Combine in Indianapolis. Coming up, a major shakeup on the coaching staff and why one move is really interesting and potentially important, at least in my eyes. We'll see how David feels about it. But first, David, before we get to Ron Rivera, and you were with him on Tuesday afternoon in Indy, Daron Payne got the franchise tag officially on Tuesday. It's going to cost the team just shy of $19 million. I think we all expected this, but what does it really mean? And here's why I asked that. They were the first NFL team, I believe, to do it, a full week ahead of the deadline. Does that signify anything to you, or is this just standard operating procedure in your eyes and fully what you expected?
Fully expected him to get the franchise tag. Didn't really have an expectation on when he would get the franchise tag, but basically what it means is everything that we've been saying for the entirety of the offseason. At least I've been saying. I think we're in agreement here. Daron Payne is going to be a Washington Commander for 2023. He's not going to be a Washington Commander in 2024. He's going to go somewhere else. He's going to get paid probably, because even if he only comes back with like 8-9 sacks or even 7 sacks, like unless he comes in below 7 sacks, people are going to look at that 2022 season and be like, okay, 7 or 8 sacks. Well, people kind of knew he was coming. We can do a little bit more with him and unlock some more with him. And so they're going to pay him. Like, he's going to get paid. And I'm all for it. I'm all for Daron getting his bag. But, he's going to get paid this year. It's a lot of money. You know what I mean? It's not a lot of security, but it's a lot of money. And he appears to be a young man who's smart with his money. I don't know his finances, but I don't, he doesn't walk into the locker room with millions of dollars of chains around his neck. So I assume that he's at least somewhat smart and frugal type of guy. And I'm happy for him. It's a good moment. It's never bad news to get told you're getting paid $19 million to do your job. But I also understand that he wants long-term security. He'll get that next year with a different team.
Yeah. So here's kind of why I asked that question. I understand exactly what you were just talking about, and I think by and large we are in agreement on that. I can't guarantee that he's going to be with a different team in 2024, and neither can you, I don't think. But
no, I can't guarantee it. Absolutely no. That's just
right,
what I think is happening.
We both believe. But here's I guess maybe the reason. Two reasons jumped out to me, and I'll bounce them off of you. One, we all know that the owner, Dan Snyder, reportedly has a cash flow problem, and he's got many other problems. So in order to come up with a long-term deal before the franchise tag deadline, before free agency, even in July, before the deadline, they got to come up with a big old bag of cash. We're talking about at least $55 or $60 million in fully guaranteed upfront funds, depending on structure, of course. But basically, you're going to have to guarantee probably at least that much to Daron Payne to get him to sign on a 5-year deal. Now, maybe if it's a 3-year deal, certainly it's a little bit less. We'll get to that. But that's number one. I don't know if the owner has that liquid cash, those liquid assets, and therefore has given Ron Rivera approval. And I know Ron was asked about that, so we can get back to that when we talk about Ron just coming up here in a sec. The other thing was, David, it struck me like, again, I think first NFL team to actually put the franchise tag on more than a week before the deadline. To me, it signifies that they're not close on a long-term deal. Like maybe they want to pay Daron $18 million, and I'm just shooting out a number per year with the requisite guarantees. And maybe Daron and his agent want $22 million a year. And they looked and said, well, listen, we have a cash flow issue. We have all sorts of other things going on. We have their entrenched in the sand on their side. We're entrenched in the sand on our side. We're too far apart. We might as well just get this over with and lock in the fee. Now, I'm not saying I know that for sure, but that's what the first thing I thought of, and that's what makes sense in my mind. The other thing is that we have to wonder about is, does Daron sign the franchise tag tender, and therefore does he participate in any of the OTAs? Remember last year he showed up to all of them, but he didn't really participate in them. I don't even know if Daron's going to sign the franchise tag tender. And if he doesn't, they can rescind the franchise tag. And also if he doesn't, he can't practice, or not that that's the end of the world, but he can't practice.
I don't think we're going to look at a holdout situation with Daron. You know what I mean? I imagine probably similar to last year, like he'll do some of the position drills and some of the sled work and all that stuff, but he's not going to do the full team practice just to protect his health. You know what I mean? And that's not a negative. Like, people have to remember, and we'll remind them when the time comes, like some of this stuff is voluntary. Like, they're working out, and there's a lot of dudes out there, but they're out there because they're volunteering to be out there. And I don't blame Daron Payne for wanting to protect his safety as much as possible in a situation like this. Cause you're basically telling him like, look, we appreciate you and you're good enough to pay you almost $20 million for a season. But that's the fiscal responsibility of the team. The defensive line is incredibly important. But you can't dump $40 million into two guys on the defensive line and expect to put together a winning, consistently winning team for longer than just one season. They can swallow that this year on the salary cap, try to work out some other deals with some other guys, get some more draft picks in here, and then next year hope to be able to replace him with a combination of Federico Mathis and some other guys, maybe some scheme shifts and all those things. So it's I don't take the franchise tag and Daron situation as an insult. It's just you happen to play with Jonathan Allen, who's one of the best, if not the best, interior defensive lineman in the National Football League, not named Aaron Donald for the last 2 or 3 years at least. So I mean, it just is what it is. And these two former Alabama guys are both going to go get paid and both be very wealthy men. And then Federico Mathis, if he gets everything he wants, is right up. He's his time's coming up too.
All right. Ron Rivera spoke today, or I should say Tuesday, at the Scouting Combine. You were there, one of the few reporters that were there. So I'm going to turn this over to you. I heard a lot of bah, 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 and not a lot of substance. What did you take?
It's a lot of coach speak. You know what I mean? He was asked some things and a lot of the reporters that are there, a lot of the media members that are there don't see him every day or don't cover the team on a day-to-day basis. So they kind of want, there's some repeat things, some things that we've already kind of asked and answered with with Ron Rivera. And then off to the side afterwards, he was asked again kind of, why the release of Bobby McCain. And that was something that I was interested in too, because I really wanted to hear the answer. And he, emphatically talked about the youth in the position and the guys that they already have outside of Bobby McCain and kind of how impressive they were. Now, I don't think it necessarily takes the position off the board for the Washington Commanders, but if you listen to some of the draft experts like the Daniel Jeremiahs of the world, a lot of these safeties really convert, kind of project to be nickels in the National Football League. And I look at the safety from Alabama specifically, and he's a guy that I look at that some people have said, maybe the Commanders will draft him. But to me, he doesn't do anything that your starting safeties don't already do. So that's kind of a question mark that they've got to be able to answer. But, the Bobby McCain release, again, not something I was surprised about just specifically for the person, but kind of the timing of it I thought was interesting. But basically he said that, they're kind of trying to kind of do these guys a solid. It's like Bobby now has the opportunity to kind of work deals and talk to people. And, they're not going to hold him until right before the NFL draft and potentially work him out of opportunities in the league. And I think that's the stand-up thing to do for a guy. If he's not part of your future, go let him be a part of somebody else's future. And give him as much time as possible to do it.
Yeah, and I think Ron did allude to that, but with both he and Carson Wentz, and that is a nice thing for them to do. If you're moving on, you're moving on, and like you said, some of those young guys really pushing, including Percy Butler, and of course Cam Curl and Derek Forrest and Jeremy Reeves, even in that mix, and quarterback a completely different situation. David, the Commanders made some coaching staff moves on Tuesday, some that we kind of thought, some that were different, some official. And then they made one really interesting designation and title that I want to bounce off of you because I think it's interesting and I think it's important. We'll do that coming up next right here on the Locked On Commanders podcast.
A lot of news and a lot of notes coming out of Indianapolis this week here at the 2023 NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis, Indiana, and the players haven't even gotten to work yet. Wednesday morning, we get our first crack at talking to some of the players, and then Thursday afternoon, they will get on the field and commence their workouts. But, we don't know who the players are going to join the Washington Commanders yet, Chris, but we do know that there have been some moves made on the staff. The Washington Commanders announcing a new quarterback coach and the movement of former quarterback coach. Now, Ken Zampese will move to the role of senior offensive advisor and game manager. And I know that you have some thoughts on that. Brett Wieselmeyer has also been promoted to defensive backs coach. Richard Rodgers has been promoted to the role of senior defensive assistant and safeties coach. And Christian Garcia has been promoted to the role of assistant defensive backs and nickel coach. So a lot of hybrid position coaches. And I mean, really, like, the NFL teams, like every year, they're expanding their coaching rosters by a couple of positions. So a lot of young coaches and some experience. Richard Rodgers, not as young as some of the others, but just getting some opportunities to get a little bit deeper in there.
Right. And we should also point out they haven't hired a new wide receivers coach to replace Drew Terrell, who they're losing to the Arizona Cardinals, but they plan to interview a couple of guys while in Indianapolis. So maybe we'll get news of that coming up. But yeah, the one that, I mean, obviously Tavita Pritchard, the former offensive coordinator of Stanford and now the quarterback coach here, jumps out because he's new and because he's Eric Bieniemy's true hire. Ron talked about how he and Bieniemy kind of think alike, operate alike, what have you. Worked in a pro-style offense. It wasn't a very successful offense at times at Stanford. It was going to be demoted anyway by the new coaching, so on and so forth. So that's an interesting one, and maybe we'll dig deeper a little bit into that in the coming days. But for me, David, and this is what I wanted to bounce off of you. They fired Jim Hostler, the senior offensive advisor the last 2 years, but they replaced him with Ken Zampese, who was the former quarterbacks coach. So Zampese stays in the organization, but what was interesting to me, not that, but they added a game management role to his title. Now, that could take on a bunch of different things, but you know, and I know, and the fans know that this team struggled significantly in game management, timeout usage, challenges, clock management, especially at the end of the first half when everybody thought they should be more aggressive and they were very conservative and afraid to make a mistake. Those three areas really jump out to me, David, as three areas of significance that this team was poor at last year. And you can make an argument it was before last year, but really last year. Do you think moving Zampese from on the field and with the quarterbacks to that sort of role can be a significant boost, or do you think it's just kind of like, oh, yeah, wake me up, I'll see it when I see it?
I mean, it could be either. You know what I mean? It really, at the end of the day, boils down to how much Ron is going to listen to him, and you assume that he puts him in the position because he's going to listen to him, and that doesn't mean he's just going to do everything that Coach Zampese says to do, but that he trusts his judgment. He trusts the way that he sees the game. And, he might have an analytics book in front of him or something with a whole lot of charts and numbers and go for it here and don't go for it there and all that stuff. But also just a guy who can maybe sit in a position to be able to say really quick, like if you're like, so, Ron Rivera, you look at head coach, I mean, his job is literally everything. Every single thing that happens on the football team, football field, practice field, locker room, press conference, it's his responsibility. So he's got kind of a wide scope lens, on this entire operation. But if you're Coach Zampese, your literal job is to look for challengeable situations, clock management. So as we're getting into that middle quarter, the last 7 minutes of the first half, the first 7 minutes of the second half, like how do we want to approach this? How do we want to attack that? And it's my job now as Ken Zampese. It's not my job to worry about the first quarter. It's not my job to worry about the second half of the third quarter. It's my job to worry about that middle quarter. And as a ball is sailing through the air and going to the sideline, I need to look. Is this thing going to be bobbled? Is this thing not going to be bobbled? Like, that's my pure focus. So if I'm good at that and I can prevent myself from just watching the ball or looking at the quarterback looking pretty, throwing the ball through the air, and I can focus on what my job is, which is identifying those things quickly and efficiently, then yeah, it can absolutely be valuable.
And not only that, and maybe again, Ron will trust more what he's getting from Zampese because he brought Zampese here, but also again, think about all of the wasted timeouts. Like, I wonder if under Bieniemy and with Zampese up in the booth, right, and not having per se a direct coaching role, if they're going to say, with 11 minutes to go in the third quarter, because we saw plenty of blown timeouts, if the 11 minutes to go in the third quarter, you know what, even though it's 3rd and 8 and it might go to 3rd and 13, we're better off taking a delay of game here as opposed to timeout 1, which is going to come back and haunt us when we're in a death match late in the fourth quarter. You see where I'm getting at? So I think these areas, because they have not had anybody in name and title in this role, I think this role, this title, if it means what I'm interpreting, and I could be wrong, I'd like to ask Ron when we get it, when I get a chance. I think this role can help them in some really, 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 really nuanced areas that they were falling consistently short in. And Ron talks about the numbers and the analytics and the guide and the charts and all that. So remember, he went for 2 when he probably shouldn't have in Detroit. And there was another controversial decision. I forget what game it was. There was all sorts of things this year, David. It's a lot to manage and a lot to get right, and he needed help.
No, it really is. You know what I mean? I wouldn't blame any coach for putting that type of person in that position. I mean, even just looking at the play clock, you know what I mean? Like, you see a lot of delay of games, especially after like big plays, because people are busy celebrating and then they're, talking, okay, well, what's next? We go, it's almost like a sudden change situation where you go from like 2nd and 2 on your own 35 to now you're 1st and 10 on their 23. Well, you really weren't necessarily planning for that to be kind of the next play. So now your brain has kind of catch up to where your field position is. And, there are kind of some certain circumstances. Now you have a coach like Ken Zampese. I don't know, I assume he's going to have like a checklist for every single play. And if I were hiring a game manager, checklist item number 1 would probably be to make sure that the play clock is set. And if an official, forgets to reset the play clock, or if it needs to get reset again, now I'm calling down the headset to Ron Rivera. Hey, they didn't reset the play clock. And now Ron can go out there and say, hey, you didn't reset the play clock, without ever having to look at the play clock because he's worried about all these other things. Like, so a game manager can be really valuable if they have the right procedures in place. And like I said, that's something, just watch football. And I mean, you see time after time, and people will point out on social media, they never reset the play clock. Well, now you have a guy whose literal job it can be to make sure that, number 1, that play clock is set. Number 2, look, you got Eric Bieniemy, who's never run his entire offense. That headset turns off at 15 seconds.
Mhm.
Hey, coach, you're at 25 seconds. Hey, coach, you're at 20. Coach, you're at 17. You know what I mean? And now we have a management system in place to help us get all these things, moving efficiently and flowing smoothly, so that people aren't getting lost in the moment and everything's under control.
Those are some good points, some extra additives that I didn't even think about. So glad we had this discussion. Again, I think it's an important hire or move or transaction, something that'll get lost in the wash, but I think something of note that is important. All right. We will be back. We want to thank you again for making the Locked On Commanders podcast your first listen and view of the day. Come on back for the next episode. David will continue along from the scouting combine in Indianapolis. What do we have? Martin Mayhew coming up. Is that right?
Yeah, we got O-linemen, or not O-linemen. We got defensive linemen and linebackers at the podium tomorrow. We also have Martin Mayhew, currently scheduled for 1 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow.
Okay.
I think it's either 1 or 2. And the Commanders, I believe, will be streaming it on their Twitter profile.
Okay, so you'll have reaction to all of that from Indianapolis at the Scouting Combine, and we'll reconvene together before the end of the week. Now make your second listen and watch the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, especially important this week with the Scouting Combine. Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez providing in-depth coverage of the biggest NFL draft prospects with deep dives into sleepers and hidden gems that can change your favorite NFL franchise. Find Locked On NFL Draft wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you want to hop in, it's Locked On Washington Commanders at gmail.com or send a DM. Twitter at LO Commanders. That's going to do it for us today, Commanders fans. Thanks again for joining us. For my partner, David Harrison, who's live in Indianapolis at the Scouting Combine, and check him out on SI.com's FanNation and Commander Country, where he is writing about the Washington Commanders and the Scouting Combine in general. I'm Chris Russell, one half of the Russell and Meadow Show on the Team 980, and always live and free on the Odyssey app. We'll be back right here on the Locked On Commanders podcast.